let's talk about her myth. So in the Roman pantheon, she is Ceres. In the Greek pantheon, she is Demeter. And I always think of course, Demeter's daughter Persephone, and she is a significant player in how I interpret Ceres and how I take Ceres in. But before we get to Persephone, and I'm just going to use the Persephone, the Greek name for her daughter, let's talk about Ceres herself. So she is one of the major players of the gods and goddesses, sister to Pluto, and all the rest. So she's the daughter of Jupiter, Demeter, the daughter of, not Jupiter, of Kronos. Zeus and Jupiter are her brother, the brother as well. So she's the goddess of the grain. You can see in this image here, she has the sheaves of grain wrapped around her head. She's wearing as a wreath on her head. So she represents the grain and the food that grows. And for one part of her narrative, for me, being the goddess of the grain, the goddess of things that grow to sustain us, food, I think of her as a nourishing, the concept of nourishment. How do we feed ourselves? And Ceres in the chart certainly gives me quite a bit of information about what we either gravitate to that nourishes us in a healthy way, or what we gravitate to that nourishes us in a way that isn't sustaining, it isn't fulfilling, things that we crave that aren't good for us, like an analogy of craving sugar or salt or fat. We know in excess those things are not good for us, but it is if that craving, it's almost as if we cannot, I've got incense burning behind me, it's almost as if we cannot help ourselves. So these two sides of this part of Ceres are really important. This nourishment, what feeds us, what sustains us. Because we think of the fundamental nature of the grain. It is something that is sustaining, right? It is the sustenance. It is fundamental grains of all kinds. And so they're everywhere in our diet. And again, for those who have grain issues, as I do, they can be difficult to digest, but nonetheless, they're fundamental and foundational through the history of humans as we have developed farming and such. The aspect of Ceres that I also bring in has to do with her daughter. Now, Ceres as mother. Ceres is one of the primary archetypes in our asteroids as sort of this primary archetype of mother. Her daughter Persephone is everything to her and is a fleshed out manifestation of her motherhood. So when Persephone is removed to the underworld, and I use the word removed intentionally, there are variations on her myth, and I don't want to focus in on the Persephone myth too much, but in what I call the patriarchal versions of Persephone, she's abducted by her uncle Pluto, raped and taken into the underworld. There's a wonderful book by one of my favorite myth books by Christine Downing. It's called The Goddess. And she does a whole chapter on Persephone, and she explores that particular narrative from a number of different angles. And she digs deeper beyond the patriarchal narratives of Homer and Hesiod and digs deeper into the older archetypes, the older myths. I would really, if you're interested, I would really encourage you to find the book. It is, in fact, out of print, but easily obtained through abe.com, or if you must, Amazon. But abe.com is a website portal for used bookstores around the world. So supporting them in that way would be awesome. But it's called The Goddess by Christine Downing, D-O-W-N-I-N-G. And so when she's removed or goes to the underworld, Ceres is plunged or plunges herself into absolute darkness of her own grief. I love one of the lines in the book that I just referenced by Christine Downing, The Goddess, where she says, only a goddess could grieve and lament so extravagantly. Because she just grieves and, you know, it's like rending, tearing her hair and howling, and in her anger grief, rage grief, she stops all the crops from growing. She plunges the world into a dark winter. And she then disappears. She disguises herself as a mortal, as a woman, and begins to wander the earth, lamenting, grieving in her way. And of course, as the world is plunged into dark winter and nothing is growing, the people begin to grow hungry. And I'll get to that part of the story in a minute. But what she does is very fascinating. She begins to wander and eventually comes across a family with a small baby, a small child, in need of a nanny, in need of a caretaker for their small son. And so she offers to care for the child, to come into their home. Of course, they do not know she is the great goddess Ceres, as she is disguised. And so she cares for the child, and she begins to devise a plan to take the child as her own, to replace what has been lost, as Persephone is now in the underworld. And in order to take the child as her own, she's going to attempt to make him immortal. And so to do that, she must place the child into the sacred fire 3 times. Before she can accomplish the 3rd act of that sequence, the family discovers her attempt, and they're horrified. They're thinking she's trying to kill the child. And she takes off her disguise and reveals herself as the great goddess Ceres. Now, what I have taken from that particular part of the myth is that, again, because Ceres has her identity wrapped up in mothering, and that Persephone was the manifestation or the representation, the place she projected all her motherhood identity. With the loss of Persephone, as she perceived it, her identity was at risk. And so from an identity ego place, Ceres needed to replace what she lost, what was taken from her in her mind. And so the ego demanded a replacement in a way. The identity needed a place to project itself to say, I am mother because I have a child. Without a child, I am not mother.